Hello, and good afternoon to those of you sharing a time zone with me, and good morning, good evening, or happy Friday, depending on where you are seated today. Regular attendees of this meeting have seen me present on the Goatman on a couple of occasions, the first time in a more descriptive and exploratory fashion based on archival records I had discovered in the Maryland Folklore Archives. The second in a more analytic and interpretive mode, correlating the Goatman legend cycle with the rise of anxiety about crime and serial killer activity in the Washington, D.C. area. Just as a quick reminder, the Goatman is a homicidal half-man, half-goat that skulks in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, woods, harassing teenagers and pets. But this presentation is not meant to rehash my Goatman research. Rather, I'm here today to present an overview of my inquiry into legendary monsters like the Goatman. The Goatman served merely as my inspiration, as a starting point, as the reason for asking. My desire was to write a full-life biography of this legendary monster, the Goatman, and I realized to do so, I needed to know more about legendary monsters in general, those from the decades and centuries before the arrival of the Goatman in central Maryland. To use a tired metaphor, I had spent so much time staring at this one tree, I wanted to step back and understand its place within the forest. If I could do that, I thought I could better understand why monster legends emerge in the first place, how monster legends take form, and their patterns of change over time and place. Then, once I'd done that, I'd take all of this learning back to my Goatman biography and be ready to get started. But it turns out this forest was a trap, and as I stepped back to view the forest, I tripped and fell straight down a rabbit hole. Now there has certainly been good scholarly research into legendary monsters in North America. Some of that research has been conducted by folklorists and legend scholars, and some of those researchers are regulars at this very meeting. With the assistance of those folks, we assembled a North American monster casebook in an attempt to better understand the history of monster legend scholarship on the continent. But as might be expected from a casebook, the results were more of a best hits of a sporadic scholarship rather than a coherent historiography of monster legends. In other words, the casebook amounted to a history of North American legendary monster scholarship, but I was still left wanting a history of North American legendary monsters. I figured in a niche subject, especially one restricted to North America only, the research possibilities would be limited. If I'm really dogged and rigorous, maybe I can hunt down a few dozen well-known North American legendary monsters to tell this story. You know, the big ones, the ones that come up over and over again on these fun internet maps like this, or this, or this. And I'll keep my data in an Excel sheet so I can play with it later. Okay, well, about a year and over 1,000 monsters later, I re-emerged from my rabbit hole and realized I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It turns out there are no less than 1,000 readily identifiable monsters out there in North America. And these are just what I'm referring to as readily identifiable. That is, monster legends that have attracted the attention of folklorists, journalists, bibliographers, podcasters, bloggers, hobbyists, some insider or semi-insider who can reveal inside information to the wider world outside the local community. There are undoubtedly thousands more that are only in local and oral circulation, but as far as knowable or attainable at the moment, right around that 1,000 monster mark, I noticed I had hit the point of diminishing returns. Now, my goal was to do some gatekeeping, to use the trending term. I had to reevaluate monster by monster and assess if each truly met my specifications to identify not just as a monster, but as a legendary monster. I had pulled instances of monsters from an incredible variety of sources, and as a devotee of repetition and variation, my preference was, of course, monsters that were covered in many places, many times, and in varying ways. What this also tuned me to were the huge number of one-time sightings that are reported as monsters. These sightings can certainly become legendary, depending on the traction and embrace they receive from the local community, like in the case of the Flatwoods Monster of Braxton County, West Virginia, or the Metal Man of Falkville, Alabama. But I think this is an important point to differentiate, the reason being that outside of our legend scholarship circles, people seem to love a good single sighting story, even if the sighting is ambiguous and does not fall within or propagate a legendary monster tradition. And this is important because I would argue folklorists do not try to answer the question, are monsters real? Which irritates non-folklorists or folklore adjacents, but that's the truth of monster research for folklorists and legend scholars. Whether a monster is real might be interesting, but it's not important. Perhaps Jesse Fivecoat puts it best in the introduction to every Encounters episode.
We are not interested in proving or disproving experiences of belief.
I'd like to offer the argument here that folklorists do not pursue the cryptozoological question, whether monsters are real, which is an applied or ostensive act, but rather pursue the folkloristic question of whether monsters are real in legend. Or, to put it in fewer words, Is this monster in question, in fact, a legendary monster? As part of my gatekeeping, I had specifications that a monster had to follow for full inclusion in the North American legendary bestiary. My rules don't have much to do with finicky definitions of monsters that scholars fuss over in the monster theory literature. In fact, I'd say my definition of monster is decidedly unfussy. I define legendary monsters as a strange, frightening, or unusual human or creature, real or imaginary, believed or not believed, that is at the time of the telling purported but not scientifically verified to exist in our world. If the subject in question seemed to match my definition of monster, I then went on to check its legendary status. That is, I wanted the monster to exist in some sort of legend cycle or legend-telling tradition, not merely as a single sighting. Even if only one person had ever seen this monster, there needed to be repetition and variation over time, however brief, and space, however contained. Why I belabor this point is because I've found much research into monsters simply fails to differentiate monster genres, ripping legend from context and freely mixing the legend genre with folktale, myth, and literary creation. Such an approach can work if the emphasis is on the monster and not the legend, but such works, even if they are excellent otherwise, make it very difficult to make a larger statement about legendary monsters. Take Jorge Luis Borges' well-known and expertly crafted Book of Imaginary Beings, which under the same covers includes the mythic Cerberus and Minotaur, the literary Cheshire Cat, tall-tale American Lumberwoods characters such as the Gillygaloo, Goofus Bird, and Hidebehind, and legendary creatures like banshees, fairies, and trolls. George Eberhardt's International Mysterious Creature Bibliography, which is excellent by the way, touches simultaneously on the native mythic underwater panther, the thought-extinct Carolina parakeet, hoaxes like the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, and more traditional legendary creatures like Memphre, the lake monster, all at once. At the other extreme, Linda Godfrey's American Monsters is a book made up almost exclusively of single sighting after single sighting, with most of these anecdotal glimpses not attached to any particular legend tradition. Books like Monsters in America teeter somewhere between the monster as metaphor paradigm and the burgeoning concept of monsterizing, where subjects as disparate as emancipated slaves, communists, and liberated bra-burning women can be seen as monsters depending on the era. To remedy this, it was important to me to pay close attention to the sources from which these monster legends derive. Because of the nature of the subject, I evaluated my sources more like a journalist than an academic. One good source was not enough. I needed multiple confirmation. For any one monster legend, I wanted it to show up in 4, 5, 6, preferably hundreds of other sources as well. I checked and cross-checked my source, not looking for the usual scholarly integrity and validity, but rather checking for repetition and variation over time and space. The sources I used included journal articles, scholarly books, and book chapters, including contributions again from many people in this society, some present at this meeting, the Maryland Folklore Archives, the Pennsylvania Center for Folklore Archives, Indiana University's Center for Folklore Archives Research, and the Berkeley Folklore Archive, in addition to numerous local and state historical societies. I pulled from historical journalistic accounts. I used books, reference materials, encyclopedias, field guides, and bestiaries. I looked at television and film sources, including Monster Quest, Monsters and Mysteries in America, and Animal X. I used podcasts, including Ben Radford's Monster Talk, Mysteries and Monsters, and the Cryptonaut. I used the Encyclopedia of Cryptozoology, also known as the Cryptid Archives, the Cryptid Wiki, Cryptopia, Pine Barrens Institute, Mysterious Universe, and the Shadowlands. And I used others still. If a monster showed up in any one of these, I was intrigued but always skeptical. When it showed up in more than one place, I began to check for variation. If it held up, I included it in my database. If after all this prodding and teasing, the legend still seemed alive,
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I began to investigate the other factors. Specifically, I wanted to take into consideration name, typology, significant dates, location, and physical description. I began, as one must, with names. Bill Ellis and Michael Dillon Foster have both written about the importance of naming in monster legends. Monster names are important and can provide the folklorists with early clues about the legend tradition. It would be difficult for a monster with no name to be said to have anything like a stable legend tradition, even if the name is ambiguous, such as the White Things of West Virginia, or the Beast of the Land Between the Lakes. There must be some sort of stability to carry the legend over space and time, and that stability usually derives from a name. The most common name formula is place plus monster synonym or monster synonym of place, such as the Beast of Bray Road, the Coal Hollow Road Monster, the Dover Demon, the Gloucester sea serpent, the Lone Pine Mountain devil, or the Chilton County wood booger, closely followed by noun plus man, such as the alligator man, deer man, dog man, or mud man, and somewhat less common, female variants, such as the basket woman or the donkey lady. On the other hand, some names are intricate and comical, often betraying a literary upbringing, such as the galley nipper, the squidgy-cum-squee, and the whirling wimpus. My favorite names straddle the perfunctory and the embellished, such as the abominable swamp slob, the Fresno nightcrawler, or the woo-woo. Secondly, I attempted to typologize and categorize. I don't claim any sort of ironclad categorization, but what I can put forward is, in the American monster pantheon, there are more monsters who fit into a handful of traditions than those who did not. While the individual variations of these are what's most interesting, I did find the typology helpful in determining the types of monsters a North American might be said to encounter when wandering the American continent. At its most general, we have the category of monstrous animals, whether they be out of place, like the New York City sewer alligator, back from extinction, like the woolly mammoth, giant mutants, like a 736-pound catfish, or undiscovered species purported to exist, like the side-hill gouger, who lives comfortably on hillsides by having one side of its body shorter than the other. We have the category of humans, or humanoids, including the uncivilized wild men widely reported in early pioneer accounts, in addition to humans with physical disabilities, deranged humans, witches, and if we include the deceased, mummies and zombies. These include the Charman of the Ojai Valley, Bunny Man of Northern Virginia, the Bandage Man of Cannon Beach, and Cropsey of the Catskills. Closely related is the category of hybrid, usually half man, half animal, such as the Goat Man of Kentucky, the Pig Man of Northfield, Vermont, the Donkey Lady of San Antonio, and Sheep Squatch of Boone County, West Virginia. In its own category, we have Sasquatches or Bigfoots of vast variety, one of the most reported categories in North America, to include the Skunk Ape, the Grass Man, the Abominable Swamp Slob, and the Farmer City Monster. Another category, Lake Serpent, competes for the most common monster sightings across North America. These include Champ and Normie and Tessie and Cressy, not to mention Chessie and Bessie and Pressy and Messy and Wessie, each denizens of their own lake in North America. Separate from the serpent tradition, we have the category of other aquatic beings, to include the Beast of Busco, Ugly Merman, and the Boondock Monster. Up in the sky, we have flying monsters, winged or not, to include the Mothman, Bat Squatch, the Snallygaster, and the Van Meter Monster. We have the category of giants, including small giants, true giants, and cannibal giants, often coming from native legend traditions, such as Gugwe and Alaquis. On the other side of the size spectrum, we have the category of little people and goblins, from native tradition, American tradition, and imported European tradition, including the black-eyed children, the fairies of Newfoundland, the Haunchies of Haunchyville, the midgets of Midgetville in New Jersey, the munchkins of Midgettown in Long Beach, California, and the Holy Cross Road gnomes of Fifield, Wisconsin. We have the category of vampires in their New World guise, including the vampire beast of Bladensboro in North Carolina, the Pine Ridge vampire of Nebraska, the chupacabra of Puerto Rico in the American Southwest, and the Richmond vampire of Virginia. We have the category of extraterrestrials, which can stand on their own as legendary monsters, but also can be combined ad nauseum with almost any other legend tradition as an explanation for the monster's sudden appearance without a breeding population or an evolutionary chain, such as the Flatwoods Monster, Osso 1, the Garson Invaders, or the Metal Man. And then we arguably have the category of digital monsters, monsters that live on the internet, though still seem able to pervade the analog world with some frequency, like the Slender Man, Siren Head, and Hat Man. Perhaps most important for my particular research goal of telling the story of legendary monsters in North America, I wanted to pay close attention to dates. I do not need to tell anyone at this conference how difficult it is to date a legend. There were multiple dates to take into account here. My goal, and I admit this, was a difficult and subjective one, was to see through all of the noise of origination and collection, and to focus instead strictly on the date in which the legend had strength and currency, which would allow me to view the monster legend in the context of its era. More on that later. I also wanted to pay close attention to place. In fact, I made locale central to my criteria for inclusion. Perhaps most important for me in paying close attention to place is working against what I call the Bigfoot singularity. The Bigfoot singularity is where each variant is seen as more evidence of the existence of one solitary being, rather than seeing each of these traditions as standing on their own. The latter approach I find to be more honest to the folklorist's monster mission. That is, evaluating which monsters are legendary monsters rather than proving, for example, whether Bigfoot is really out there. By sorting my data in this way, I've been able to manipulate the data alphabetically, which has been helpful in identifying variants within a tradition, geographically to show the dispersion of these monster legends, typologically to show general similarities over very different legendary monsters, and perhaps most important for my particular interests, chronologically. By sorting chronologically, themes began to emerge, and the story of legendary monsters in North America, in a way, presented itself to me. Now this section is in the preliminary stages, and I'm sure you'll be subject to many more presentations on the following theses over the next few years. What I'm beginning to find is that each period of monster legends corresponds not only to a particular era in North American cultural history, but also to particular folklore genres that intertwine with legend. The first is the era of legend, myth, and monsters in Native America. The second, legend, rumor, and monsters in early America. Third, legend, tall tales, and fearsome critters in frontier America. Fourth, legend, ostension, and cryptozoology in post-war America. Fifth, legend, panic, and serial killers in late 20th century America. And sixth, the era of legend, creepypasta, and viral hoaxes in New Millennium America. Allow me to conclude with this. You can't read a book about monsters without the author stopping at some point to inform you that the word monster comes from the Old French monstre, from the Latin monstrum, portent, or monster, meaning a portent or warning. So in that case, I want to ask, what do legendary monsters portend for the future of monster studies? Some see monsters best offering as material for studying constructions of difference, discomfort, and disgust, especially with reference to race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. These arguments are compelling, but I would point out certainly not new, as they've been part of monster theory from its inception, highlighted as one of Jeff Jerome's 7 theses. Others seem to posit that the digital possibilities of monster studies are the next frontier, of interest to both laymen and legend scholars. But I would point out folklorists and legend scholars have been on that case for over a decade, including numerous excellent publications, again, by scholars in this society. Combining the previous two, the digital world and the idea of cryptids, gender, and sexuality seems to be colliding on social media, especially in regards to Mothman, and yet again, I commend members of our society, in this case Ellie Haskin, for being on that case years ago and presenting on the very topic in Memphis. Others might point out monsters and cryptids as a fashion aesthetic, known as cryptid core, seemingly inspired by vintage 1980s and early 90s fashion, especially as portrayed in nostalgic media like the Duffer Brothers television show Stranger Things and Stephen King's movie adaptation of It. And then there's the verb monsterizing, or sometimes monsterization, which emphasizes the emergent, contextual, and performative aspects of legendary monsters. From this perspective, legendary monsters are not found but enacted, encouraging process over text and performance over static entities. This approach is rich with possibilities for the future, but also rife with risk if not used carefully. That is, with a careful distinction between literal monsters and metaphorical monsters. And then there's monsters as an oft-overlooked part of conspiracy theory. That is, monsters as the result, the outcome, the proof, the physical manifestation of purported conspiracy theories. To circle all the way around to where we began, take the Goat Man. The Goat Man is proof of the strange, forbidden experiments performed at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. The Billywhack monster is proof the OSS was attempting to develop super soldiers in Santa Paula, California to combat Nazi Germany. And the Chupacabra is proof the government is covering up the fact Puerto Rico is a base for extraterrestrial visitation. To conclude, I'd like to return to my initial questions. Where do North American legendary monsters come from, and how are legendary monsters made? I haven't reached a fully satisfactory answer just yet, but I want to assure my fellow society members it's an active case and the investigation is ongoing. My working hypothesis moving forward is that era and environment shape legendary monsters, and at times, legendary monsters just might shape eras and environments. But that's for future ISCLR meetings. Thank you.